As a scholar of German Jewish studies myself, I was interested, when I came to Baruch a few years ago, what role Jewish studies might play in the life of Baruch College and the Weizmann School of Arts and Sciences. But beyond my personal interest, it became clear to me immediately that the rich and diverse history of Jewish immigration that had made New York City such a great city was intertwined very, very intimately with the traditions of Baruch College, especially in its early years. Today, our students are still immigrants, although not as many of them Jewish as they were 20, 30, 40 years ago. But as many of our alumni point out, the students at Baruch may look different, but they're still part of a tradition that is consistent with the educational and social values of Baruch College and the City University of New York. Consequently, when it became possible to advance a Jewish studies project here at the college, we decided to focus on Jewish life in New York City as part of the American Jewish fabric that is so closely related to the important issues of identity and community and diversity, both within the Jewish community, which you'll see and hear about tonight, and outside of the Jewish community. I just very briefly want to tell you what this Jewish Studies Center is going to be about. It's going to have 4 parts: an academic program that focuses on the immigrant Jewish New York City experience, and that is being directed by our moderator tonight, Professor Jessica Lang of the Department of English. It will have an arts and culture component, and as you know, we already have the National Yiddish Theater here in residence at Baruch College. It will be an umbrella for all of the Jewish organizations that exist, like Hillel and many other organizations here at the college, and it will, above all, be a community outreach. We hope to have continuing education courses for people in the community, and we hope to have programs, a rich series of programs that will be open to the public, as this event tonight was.
Thank you all for joining us tonight as we celebrate the launch of our new Jewish Studies Center. I use the word celebrate because it characterizes what this center will do. It will serve as Baruch College's home for the celebration and study of Jewish life in America and in the city of New York in particular. I am personally very excited about the conceptual approach that Jeff Peck and his colleagues have developed for the center, especially given the storied history of Baruch and the tens of thousands of Jewish men and women who have attended this school, both when it was part of the City College and in the years since it became an independent senior college of CUNY. The New York metropolitan area has the highest concentration of Jewish population in the United States, and among these households are countless family histories of immigration from dozens of countries, primarily in Central and Eastern Europe and the states of the former Soviet Union. As we know, many of these histories involve terrible ordeals of persecution, forced dislocation, pogroms, and ultimately the Shoah. But those who came to the New World, willingly or because they had no choice, formed a vibrant subculture, one that has prospered here and in the process contributed enormously to the cultural richness and diversity and economic growth of the city of New York. As the new president, now in all of my 4th month on the job, I'm still learning about Baruch's culture and its history. But one thing that is clear is that the college is an extraordinarily diverse and inclusive place. Indeed, we are very proud of the fact that U.S. News & World Report once again has ranked Baruch on this year's list of most ethnically diverse colleges. That didn't happen by accident. We have a student body that represents 160 nations and speaks more than 100 languages, and we work hard to maintain that diversity. We coexist and engage with each other. We are a community that isn't limited by ethnic diversity, but also embraces a breadth of ideas and thought. We want our faculty and students to ask questions, to propose ideas, and to engage in debate. At Baruch College, we are also very much aware of our place in the city that was built and populated by immigrants. The father of our namesake, Bernard Baruch, emigrated to America from Europe. And to this day, a large number of our students are first-generation Americans or the sons and daughters of immigrants. We rely on that heritage to help shape our consciousness as a community. And we expect that the Jewish Studies Center will further enrich the knowledge of our heritage while also enabling us to to achieve even higher standing in the intellectual community. We will continue to engage experts and contributors of all stripes to make the center a destination for scholarship, exploration, and celebration.
William Butler Yeats, the great British poet, said that education is not filling a bucket, but it is lighting a candle. Education is not filling a bucket, but I think it's lighting a fire. Is not filling a bucket, but lighting a fire. More than ever, in a very complicated world, in a world that's looking for shortcuts all the time, in a society that can be coarsening both through the challenges of the times, the vicissitudes of the economy, and our struggling to figure out how to bring nuance into the social media, we have to always recognize that education is not about simply downloading information for young people. It's not enough. It's not enough to advance our civilization. It has to be about transmitting ideas and ideals, passion and purpose. It has to be about saying there are noble thoughts, ideas, challenges, opportunities that education is the key to. And this institution has always served that purpose. With a different population from time to time, but the same people. And it is critical that you in leadership positions never allow education to become a commodity or a credential, but it really has to be something that can enrich the soul and the spirit and drive us forward toward nobility. And I think that it's in that spirit that I celebrate with you the opening of this center. As one of the world's, I guess, greatest centers for Jewish learning and Jewish studies, and the largest Jewish university outside the state of Israel, maybe even with the state of Israel, Yeshiva University represents the importance of the Jewish story to the advancement of civilization, and stands as a bulwark for that. It certainly represents at its undergraduate level the place where modern Orthodox young men and women continue their journey towards leadership in the Jewish community, and we certainly want all that to happen. But it also represents the Jewish idea, Jewish thought and study, and the notion that Jews both have an opportunity and an obligation to explore all areas of ideas, to explore and to succeed in all fields of endeavor, and to accept the responsibility of partnering with other people of goodwill to advance civilization. There are a few schools more gifted in diversity than Baruch is, and of uniformly high quality. And therefore, not just the fact that there is a significant Jewish population, and I certainly think all the Jewish students who aren't coming to Yeshiva University should be here at Baruch. But this initiative, exploring the historical and cultural impact of Jewish life on New York, and New York kind of as a model and a microcosm of society, is a natural for a school that doesn't seek to download information and doesn't seek to fill a bucket, but seeks to kindle fires.
In the spirit of what has been said this evening about the focus of our Jewish Studies Center, we are having a panel of representatives of a number of the different Jewish communities which live in New York, and to represent the diversity of the Jewish communities of New York City.
Starting us off this evening, Mr. Dreyfus will address the following question. Many children raised in immigrant households characterize themselves as, in various ways, foreign within the larger American community, and also foreign within the community their parents designate as home. How has the immigrant legacy from your parents helped you? How do you understand the often tense relationship between the assimilation of first-generation Americans and the desire also to identify themselves in the culture that defines their parents?
Thank you, Jessica. I grew up at the very bottom, and being generous in this, of what was called the Fourth Reich, which was Washington Heights. But Yeah, except that I was on 139th Street. So those of you who know. The community that I actually grew up in was largely Afro-American and Hispanic down at 139th Street. And the German Jews, and there were, a community of them there, were in the minority. And so I never really encountered sort of this tension that Jessica alludes to, but it's interesting. My grandmother who raised me, my mother worked, my dad worked, she arrived here when I was a year and a half old, and the lowest common denominator was German. So I grew up bilingual. And my mother and grandmother always told the story that even as a 2-year-old, I knew who to speak German to and who to speak English to. And it's sort of, you grow up in that kind of household. And the German-Jewish experience, certainly among my parents' friends, I'm an only child. They generally, if they had a son, that was it. If they had a daughter, they ended up with 2 daughters. These were truly refugees. I mean, these were people, and I'll come back to this theme in a moment, very cautious, very concerned, very frugal, out of necessity. And, not knowing, I remember as a young child going up to the Fourth Reich in Washington Heights to these Sunday coffee klatches, and I can still smell the coffee and taste the delicious cakes that they all baked. But this is the late 40s. People would get together and try to find out where family members were or friends ended up after the war. There was a fabulous newspaper, some of you may remember it was called the Aufbau, which literally means reconstruction or rebuilding. And that tried to connect these people also. But let me go back to the idea of refugee. That had a very dramatic imprint on me, Jessica. And I think what I took from the German-Jewish experience, and it was not only my parents, it was within the community. There were a few outliers who, lived a higher life or a more extravagant life, but very few. Everyone was very cautious, and that caution, plus the wonderful education that I received here at Baruch, and many of you have read my devotion to a distinguished professor of accounting here, a dear friend, Professor Abraham Brilloff, who's 93 years old and was my mentor. And the confluence of the refugee mentality and the education I got here enabled me to have some success as a portfolio manager and investment advisor. And it really came to be expressed and drawn out. I was, as you may have seen in the bio material, in 2008, I got an award from Morningstar, and I ended up on the PBS show Wealth Track. And Consuelo Mack, who is the moderator of that show, we were engaging in conversation, and she says, Charlie, you're so cautious, and you're known as belts and suspenders and risk adverse, and you're known for preservation of capital, and first and foremost, what's the genesis of that? And I thought for a moment, and my response was, and still is, the refugee mentality. It's innate. It just, it was transferred. Yes, I was born here, but that legacy, along with a very, rich pictorial and narrative memory that my mother particularly shared with myself and my wife and daughter who are here, just permeated things. But that entire notion of caution, the German Jewish community is known for many things, not everything being particularly great. But the one thing that, arriving here early, I also invoked, which is, actually my daughter had written a poem regarding it, but many of you will know because it is also a Yiddish term, Pünktlichkeit. It's extreme earliness. I arrived here at 4:45. This is sort of the German DNA, but a large part of that German DNA is very much, preservation. I mean, not that it isn't true of other Jewish communities, but for some reason, growing up in that community, that's what I took from it. And it wasn't a disadvantage. I took from that something that enabled me to carve out a niche for myself in my respective area of employment.
Thank you. We'll next hear from Mr. Frankel, who in previous conversations has positioned the Russian Jewish community as among the most successful of immigrant communities in New York and even in America because of their commitment to education, especially higher education. Mr. Frankel has made the point that often members of the Russian and former Soviet Union Jewish community come to this country with higher degrees and greater proficiency in a range of skills. What is the relationship between the Russian Jewish community and American higher education? And in what ways does the education here in the United States resonate or perhaps differ with the educational values of the former Soviet Union?
Well, you heard my name, so I will try to go a little bit around the question by telling you a little bit about myself, because that will give the foundation of why my thinking is shaped the way it is. Because in history of Jewish life, any despot or any dictator who would have taken whatever they could from us, they couldn't take one thing, is our heads. Because after the heads are gone, there is nothing left. And that was making our immigration that much stronger because we were fortunate that Soviet education gave us this big foundation on which we were able to build in the new land. What Soviet education lacked in creativity, though, it was strong in fundamentals. And if you look at previous immigrations, mostly they were by poor people coming for a better life. Like this country was called Golden Medina in Yiddish for a reason. But I'll start with a little bit of my background. I was born in Kiev, Ukraine in 1955, and in a family where my grandfather was an Orthodox Jew who for 90 years kept kashrut under Soviet regime. But at the age of 7 in first grade in my school, a Ukrainian kid punched me on the nose and said, "You're a kike." And I had no idea what it meant. So when I came home, my mother gave me my first lesson in Jewish studies. She explained what it was. Moving forward, by the age of 12, we were coming to the shul, which only had 200 seats in a city probably of 200,000 Jews, to protect our elderly on the way home so Ukrainian hooligans wouldn't beat them up. So that was my second lesson in Jewish education. In the next few years, at the age of 17, my parents told me, look, we cannot help you to get into college in Kiev. And they were right, because out of 50 kids who graduated with me from high school who were honors in math and science and everything, 0 got in 1972. They said, you have to go to Siberia. And for a kid in Russia, living family is a very dramatic experience. You have no money, no nothing, and you're very much attached to a family. But here I went. And it combined life in Siberia with my third lesson in Jewish life. By accident, my parents smuggled Leon Uris's book, Exodus. When I read the book, I realized that my name is not Felix, I'm Ari Ben Kanan. I'm an Israeli, and I'm going to change the world. So moving forward, in a few years, my parents said, look, we should immigrate. I said, immigrate where? I'm almost with Masters of Science in Civil Engineering. I hate languages. Why are we going to do that? But in Russia, when parents tell you what to do, you just do it. So we went. When I came to the United States, by accident, I got into 3 colleges in the city of Philadelphia. I had no idea which one was which. So one was University of Pennsylvania Wharton School, one was Temple University, and one was Drexel University. So by accident, a librarian in local library, an Irish guy who was 7 foot tall, looked like a biker, and he spoke Russian, and he said, don't even think about it. If you go to Wharton, the doors will open for you which you cannot dream of, which I did. In spite of the fact that parents told me $5,000 borrowing, you'll be in a debtor's prison, you'll never come out. Moving forward, I never thought that University of Siberia on your resume has an impact in your life. So my resume, by accident, gets to Ace, Alan Greenberg, the chairman of Bear Stearns. So he reads my resume, and at the bottom it says University of Siberia. So he goes, you know what? I never had people from one area, Siberia. I had embezzlers and I had Nobel laureates, but never one like that, and I got my first job. But jokes aside, quickly I got involved, like my career moved fast, and I got involved in Jewish communal life. And my first amazing experience was coming to Wall Street Division dinner, where I saw 2,000 young and not so young Jews celebrating their Jewishness, that they were able to help their community. It blew me away that I could do the same thing. Going forward, it's 40 years later, I am dealing with a lot of Jewish communal things. I feel indebted to my American cousins who were able to transplant 1.5 million Soviet Jews all over the world and let them settle to their liking, not to the liking of some other people, which is probably unprecedented in the history of mankind, where such a big group of people was transported to live good life, not to be killed. Now going to the question of the day, which was, why do I think Russian immigration is excelling so much? And it's a good answer in this space, because that's where people get their education. That's where the value of that education should be given. And people should realize, we Jews will always be hated by the outsiders, but our ability to carry our knowledge, because we're called people of the book for a reason. We carry it from centuries to centuries, including 1,000 years of Yiddish culture, 5,000 years of Jewish culture, from continent to continent, and we survived. We didn't survive with assets, we didn't survive with anything. We survived with knowledge and education. So to me, that's the answer to your question. And let me quote, I'm almost running out of time. David Mamet, in The Wicked Son, said about Jewish education and Jewish studies in particular, and I'll paraphrase it. Jews study Hebrew for Torah, Aramaic for Talmud, and Yiddish and the sociology of the thousands of years of European diaspora and civilization. These studies, whether of years or decades, might confirm in the student an awe of the civilization that gave him life and a deep longing for further knowledge. That's what this place should do. That's what Jewish Studies Center will bring to this place, in addition to its greatness as it is today.
Thank you. Now for the question addressed to Alyssa Shams. As someone who has worked to lend presence and voice to the Sephardic community, and more specifically to the Syrian community, can you hear me? Yes, thank you. In New York, how do you account for the absence of representation of this community in cultural and historical documentation? What changes have been effected over the past generation to remedy this absence, and how have these changes influenced the traditional bearings and identity of the Syrian community?
I think of all the panelists, I probably represent diversity the most. I don't think it's a secret. I'm an American girl with American parents and Polish grandparents representing the Syrian community. And you may find that kind of comical, but it maybe fits into sort of why I'm up here today. I grew up in Brooklyn, New York as an Ashkenaz woman, went to Yeshiva of Flatbush, and many of my friends as a child were Sephardic. So I feel that certainly by osmosis, my knowledge of the Syrian community is vast from an early age. I met my husband while I was in college, and he is Syrian with one Ashkenaz grandparent, and I think he too represents diversity and probably can explain sort of some of the mindset of the divergent Syrian approaches to life and to coming to this country. As an Ashkenaz woman, and for many years, I often asked myself, who is the Chaim Potak of the Syrian community? In other words, who is the person that's going to tell the story of the immigrant Syrian community coming to this country and acclimating to life in America? And I think more recently, I've been asking the question of who is going to be the documentor or the historian that is going to make sure that the history, the rich history of Syrian and Sephardic Jews is present in history books, in classrooms, in conversation, I would say. I recently received a present, a coffee table book, a Jewish history atlas. One of these large books takes up half your coffee table, and I started leafing through it, and you have every aspect of Jewish history, starting from biblical times, and certainly the Ashkenaz community represented, and I'm leafing, and I'm looking in the index, and really, it's absent of the Middle Eastern story, the Jewish Middle Eastern story. And it's kind of upsetting. I think it's certainly upsetting to the Sephardic community. And the question that Jessica is asking me is, why is that so? And I've tried to answer that question tonight, and I don't think there's a science to it. This is sort of my own theory, and a theory I think that maybe some others have shared in conversation with them. So you have to understand that the Middle Eastern Jewish community did not have the same exposure to the culture of the Enlightenment that the Western Jewish world did. And so basically, from the old country, there was probably no impetus to necessarily document or write down the story, certainly in a novel form or even in a historical form. And I think coupled with that, there's certainly a culture of superstition, one where you don't highlight certain things about yourself, certainly because of the evil eye. You don't mention the positive, and I think more importantly, I think there's a culture in the Sephardic community that does not like to mention the negative. And so in my understanding, when the immigrant community came in the early 20th century to this country, they were coming from harsh conditions in cities like Aleppo and Damascus. And they came to this country, and although it was called the Golden Medina, or the streets paved with gold, it was quite difficult for them. And so I believe that, unlike the Ashkenaz community, which has sort of made a lifetime of lamenting about tragedy because unfortunately they had been exposed to so much tragedy, the Sephardic community sort of remained silent about where they had come from and certainly what they were experiencing initially, I would say. And I think it took some time for the community, the Syrian community, to build itself from within, and certainly it is quite successful, both financially and communally. Amazing infrastructure has been created from the community, and I think as the community grew in its stature and in its prominence and pride, I think there began a desire to sort of tell the story. And I think initially it wasn't even met with maybe such great response from the community internally. I think because of the superstitious nature, I remember years ago the first people sort of talking about the Syrian community were met with some controversy. We don't talk about those things. We don't want to really highlight who we are. We kind of keep to ourselves. But I think of late, and I think maybe possibly because there was a second wave of Syrian immigration in the 80s, I think there was definitely a reawakening or a re-understanding of the importance of, I think, where the Sephardic community originated from, the great traditions of the old country, of Syria, of specifically Aleppo, Damascus. And I think that there was a desire in a confident way to start documenting and telling the story. And, I can mention several projects that I've been, part of that I think really tell an amazing story of the Sephardic community. I'll mention a few. There's a wonderful book called Aromas of Aleppo, which presents as a cookbook, actually, but that's a very telling type of a book to write about the Syrian community because food plays such an intrinsic part in the Syrian culture. And within the recipes, there's a wonderful outlay of tradition and how the women got together and created these delicacies, plus a whole sort of understanding of the culture that these foods came from. Another book, or an interesting one, I think, is there's a book written by one of the community rabbis, actually a compilation of the history of Aleppo, and I think trying to sort of highlight the scholars of Aleppo, a proud religious community. And funny, that one sort of was met with a bit of controversy from some scholars, feeling that there was a bit of revisionist history in there, that they depicted sort of a life in Aleppo that looked more like maybe a life in Lakewood, New Jersey, a more current religious attitude. And it's interesting when you take time to sort of document history, I guess there is some revisionist history, in there. And then more recently, I'm sure there are people in the audience who had the privilege of being in Lincoln Center a few weeks ago. There's an amazing initiative to not only to document Sephardic history in a 9-part documentary series, and actually funny, it began with number 2, which was coming to this country. Number 1, which will be a documentation of life in the old country, is still in the works because I think it's harder for them to probably gather the information about that period. But the number 2 that was shown in Lincoln Center was an amazing documentary, oral histories of many people that were in the audience, which was very nice to see, talking about their experience coming to this country. And, for the Ashkenaz community, that may be passé already, we've heard so much, but I think it was a tremendous accomplishment for the Syrian community. People were just beaming that night just to hear these stories. And funny enough, I remember my Ashkenaz grandmother clearly telling me her stories in her old country in Poland. And my husband said his family history remained absent to him, that his family for some reason did not discuss, probably because of this sort of resistance to deal with unpleasantries. And so I think that, just as the Syrian community was very influenced by its Muslim brothers in the country that they came from, I think, being in this country for the last 100 years, there's no doubt that as insular as the Sephardic community or the Syrian community presents, it's influenced by the Ashkenaz community and by the greater world and Western world that it lives in, is sort of compelling the Syrian community to tell its story. And as a result, I think we're all going to be beneficiaries of hearing this wonderful and rich tradition of the Syrian people.
Thank you. David, you characterize yourself as a Jewish businessman who's internationally engaged and community-oriented. Can you address your commitment to both global entrepreneurship, which ties in closely to your international background, and your roots in the local Iraqi Jewish community?
Thank you. I think, like all the other panelists before me, I have to put it in context. My father left Baghdad in 1936 to go to Japan. It probably was not unusual for Baghdadians to leave to go east, considering the Silk Route that existed hundreds of years before, considering the families like the Victor Sassoon family, the Hardoon family, the Kaduri family who went to the China and the Far East. So when he was offered an opportunity to go and manage a textile firm's agency in Osaka, Japan as a 20-year-old or a 22-year-old, he probably didn't think about it very long. So the entrepreneur spirit is probably there for all Iraqis. Getting to Japan and finding a small Jewish community in the middle 30s, he probably did not, he did feel an interest in retaining his Jewishness, so that meant observance of as many rituals as possible. and within a short period of time, with other businessmen from Aleppo and Syria, and created a Sephardic community that throve during the period of World War II. I say all this because while I'm here to talk about the Iraqi Jewish community of New York and the contributions that they've made, I think it's important to understand that every story is unique, and my father's background and what he taught us and what he instilled in us as what is important is part of that uniqueness. The Iraqi community in Baghdad that had been there in Babylon since 568 had to leave in the early 50s. There were a few hundred people left after the 50s, after the mass forced emigration from Iraq. Most of the people went to Israel. I would say probably close to about 90,000 or maybe even more. A large community was then established in London, but that also had to do with the Iraqi community that was based in Manchester before that, that was part of the textile industry. A large group of Iraqis left for Montreal, and of course, a large group joined their family and relatives here in New York. The Iraqi community is not unlike the Syrian community in the sense that they did not attempt to establish themselves and their history outside the community. They melded more in quietly. They assimilated quietly. And as a result, you have few examples of Iraqis and prominent Iraqis in the city and around the world, but I think it's less so. They're probably fairly quiet. Having said that, they also did not build the kinds of institutions that a lot of the other communities did. They didn't build their schools for Iraqi students. They didn't build synagogues. They didn't build the Bikur Cholim or the hospitals or any of those institutions. They only just recently began to get together as groups around a central institution, I would say after the immigration here into the United States of the Iraqi community that went to Iran. So that community was very, very active, very, very, they considered themselves as a very strong group, brought in the existing Iraqi community with them and established a much stronger, wider community for all. With respect to global entrepreneurship, I touched on the issue before. I think Iraqis generally, if you wanted to stereotype them, you find many of them as professionals. Maybe many communities can say that, you know, accountants, doctors, lawyers. You find, today you find many more poets and writers, but generally speaking, you'll find them, you'll find many of them in business. And that includes the retail, it includes, and it especially includes import-export. There are numbers of times that I've met people, and it's obvious from their last name, that they're Iraqi, and you would find them creating agencies or representation offices all over the world. So I think the international bent is just part of the nature and part of the background. The entrepreneurial spirit has to be, I think, just as much so the background of Iraqis growing up. And finally, in my case, the sense of being involved in a Jewish community and contributing and building. My father built and was the leader of the synagogue in Kobe, and my family have all been active in building Jewish institutions and helping Jewish institutions wherever they are. And I think that's not, that in my case, that I can set as an example. I think also that it's important to know that With respect to Iraqis, there's a huge Judaic and historical tradition. So even though it may not be overt, studying Talmud Bavli is studying a lot of what was developed in Iraq over hundreds of years, and some of the leaders of both the Judaic world and the scholars were based in Iraq even until the 1940s. So I will only summarize by saying that my background led me to be interested in business, to be interested in international affairs, to be out there and enjoy the international relationships that one builds. And of course, since the establishment of the State of Israel, to be concerned about Israel and to be able to help support the family that came there without very much. And I try to continue to be supportive of that effort. Thank you.
So we're moving on now to Nazi Moynihan. The Persian Jewish community is one defined by an ancient history in the Middle East. In New York, however, it has the distinction of being one of the most recent Jewish immigrant communities to take root. Most Iranian Jewish families moved here in 1979 or 1980 as a result of political turmoil and security concerns. Because of their deep and contemporary ties to Iran, what relationship between the United States and Iran does the Persian Jewish community deem appropriate?
Thank you, Jessica, and good evening. I thank you for this question. I actually collaborated with you on this question because I wanted it to be a bit about international relations and foreign policy, which is the field I'm most comfortable with. And I think Iran, for very unfortunate reason, is the country that everyone is concerned about. Front pages of all newspapers, Secretary of State, the President, it's top agenda for most policymakers, and for good reason. The reason this question is so important is because there is a general lack of understanding of what Iran is or stands for. Iran is a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. And if you put your mind in that frame, you can understand what an Iranian is, which is not far, unfortunately, from this a collusion of many different backgrounds. Iran is at a crossroads of different cultures, Zoroastrianism, Islam, Western culture, a big affinity for Americans. To this day, 77% of Iranians that were asked recently in a questionnaire if they would like to have relationships with the US, they actually positively said yes, and the sooner the better. The general misperceptions about Iran permeates to how we as Iranians and Iranian Jews introduce and identify ourselves, and how we would like to see the two countries hopefully have a rapprochement and build bridges and have a normal relation. To that extent, Iranians in New York are divided. They are Iranian Jews. Excuse me, I keep going to say Iranians, but Iranian Jews. We've been there for 2,600 years, so part of us is still back there. Unfortunately, we can't go back. We have patriotic ties to this wonderful country that embraced us so wonderfully. We have spiritual ties to the State of Israel, but we have sentimental ties, strong sentimental ties to the country of our birth. And the New York and Los Angeles Jewish community is divided on the question of what to do with Iran. Of course, we all would love to see a normalized relation. It's the country that helped kick the Soviets out of the northern Iran post-World War II. They built schools and hospitals during the Shah's regime. They modernized the country. They built roads along with European engineers. A great relationship. Nixon famously turned to the Shah of Iran and said, "Protect me," as one of the pillars of his foreign policy. So it used to have, unfortunately, good relations, which is not there anymore. Iranian Jews, because of their devotions to the State of Israel, do not want to see any bargain made at the expense of any harm to the state of Israel. And the relationship they see moving forward between US and Iran is a normalizing a relation that first and foremost takes care of the rights of the Israelis and their land and ownership and Jerusalem and all the charities that we as a community donate to are in a way attached to state of Israel or to the hospitals that are here and have a relationship with Israel. I myself would like to see a normalized relation in a way that we don't have to bomb the country, which is an option that is always on this proverbial table. I'd like to know where that table is because I'd like to go and see and talk to those people and get a sense of what's happening, because the sooner we take care of that volatile part of the world, the better, and then we can shift our focus to Pakistan. Right. Very dangerous country, very dangerous country. If you ask many Iranian Jews, they do not want to go back to Iran. They are very successful, they're professionals, great business people. Actually, Iran, according to US Census Bureau, Iranian immigrants are the most educated, most income garnering of any group of immigrants ever in the history of the United States. And a large part of that is due to the perseverance and work ethics of Iranian Jews. A day doesn't go by that I tell my kids that, this is one of the greatest countries in the world, and look at all the blessings that you have. You wake up in the morning, you go to the best schools, and look at all the good things that they gave us, and here we are in Iran burning their flag. And it's not lost on any of us. Again, based on how warmly the Iranian Jews were welcomed in the US, Iranian Jews in New York and in LA, many of them do not see Iran in their future, and therefore they do not care. And many of them, including me, are trying hard to make a foreign policy that makes sense for both countries, because it's a country that's in a very important region in the world. Having normalized relations with Iran is an important array of foreign policy that we need to take care of. And I think I answered your question.
Thank you. Now we'll hear from our final panelist, Dov Schlein. Your birth year coincides with the same year as the establishment of the State of Israel. In what ways has the innovative spirit of this period carried over into the diaspora? And how has your upbringing in Israel in the 1950s and early 60s influenced your long-term vision of entrepreneurship and business?
Thank you, Jessica. I'll start by telling you a bit about my background and my upbringing in Israel in the 1950s and 1960s before I came to New York City. I was born in December of '47. My birth certificate actually says the British Mandate of Palestine. The British at the time were preparing to depart Palestine, and the Ben Gurion, of course, was preparing the Declaration of Independence. That's historical facts. I obviously don't recall any of it. My parents were Holocaust survivors who met in the displaced person camps in Germany after World War II. In '46, they were smuggled into the British Mandate of Palestine by the Jewish Agency, of course against the wishes of the British, and they ended up in a kibbutz in northern Israel, En Efrat, and I was born shortly thereafter. As Israel declared its independence in May of '48, the war with the Arab states started, and my father was drafted, and my mother and myself remained in the kibbutz. After the War of Independence, we moved from the kibbutz to an old, abandoned, one-room destroyed house in nearby city of Haifa. For the next 15 years, until I arrived in New York looking for my free college education, we lived in Haifa. Haifa is, for those of you who haven't been there, it's a port city in northern Israel at the foothills of the Carmel Mountains. It was a small city at the time, and it just exploded. As a youngster, all that I saw was continuous construction. We were building new new homes. My father initially worked as a construction worker, building thousands, literally thousands of apartment buildings that were needed to accommodate the waves of immigrations that were coming to Israel and to Haifa. Just about all of my neighbors were immigrants from the diaspora. In the first 3 years of the state of Israel, its life, the population doubled from 800,000 to 1,600,000. Both at home and in school, we were living the Zionist dream. We were creating a Jewish state. Imagine living in a city where you continuously, everything is being transformed. New streets, new roads, new parks, new schools, hospital, the modern port facility. Haifa was the main port of Israel. A sports stadium next to my house. A beautiful but very, very short subway. Parks, transportation hubs, etc. So I was in the midst of something that was continuously evolving, and it was very exciting. The schools in Haifa were very good. And education was deemed to be the #1 priorities for just about all the families in my neighborhood. The attitude around me was that of, you can do anything. And we received an increased sense of security after the 1956 war with Egypt. An Egyptian Navy destroyer came to the port of Haifa and started bombarding the city. And miraculously, it was disabled in a counterstrike, and it ended up being towed into the port of Haifa for all of us to see. So I basically witnessed the first Arab-Israeli war as a 9-year-old kid. When I arrived in New York City, a cousin of the family had written that in New York, college education is free. Haifa at the time had the Technion, but for the technology school, but did not have a university. And so the suggestion was that I should come to New York and complete my university education in New York City. As a 60-year-old, it was very exciting. I was speaking classroom English, certainly had a very excited view of the world. I was ready to experience New York. My family remained in Israel, and I was staying initially with these relatives, which were themselves immigrants from Haifa. My father came to New York 2 weeks in the summer of '64, just as I arrived. He wanted to make sure that I was in good hands. And his parting gift to me was to take me to Delancey, to the Lower East Side, and buy me 4 suits at $25 a piece. He felt that was appropriate for me to present myself in school. On my first day in school, I was of course mistaken for the teacher. That was the last time that I wore those suits until graduation. My first and I guess most memorable impression when I arrived in New York was the amazing New York World's Fair of 1964. In fact, myself and my father went to look at it. It was incredible. All the exhibits of urban America, the superhighways, the networks, it was just an amazing. The theme of the fair was Challenge to Greatness. A film illustrated the contribution of immigrants to New York City. It was, to me, the center of the world. Clearly, my upbringing in Israel was very positive. I was in the midst of nothing but the positive growth of a country. So to come to New York and to see this challenge of greatness and be in the greatest city in the world, it was just fantastic to me, and I felt I was ready for it. In 1986, the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal ran a story in the business section that a 38-year-old Baruch student has been promoted to president of Republic National Bank of New York. The next day, the president of Baruch College called for an appointment. As a banker at the time, I knew well that he was coming to collect the past due loan. The free university education that I got came, of course, with a future obligation. And, of course, I did not object, and I accepted his offer to join the Baruch College Fund. Recently, I read a book, and if you haven't, I would highly recommend it. The book's name is Startup Nation. And it's about Israel and how Israel became a highly developed and technologically advanced country in 60 years. I'd just like to quote a few things from the book, which I think would help answer, Jessica, your question. Immigrants are not averse to starting over. They are, by definition, risk takers. A nation of immigrants is a nation of entrepreneurs. Israel's economic miracle is due as much to immigration as to anything else. When I was born, the population was 800,000. 62 years later, the population is 7.2 million, an incredible nine-fold growth. 1/3 of the country today is foreign-born, 3 times the rate of foreigners to natives here in the US. Israel, in fact, is a mini Baruch College. It is the home of more than 70 different nationalities and cultures. You have just heard about Russian Jewry. Between 1990 and 2000, during that decade, 800,000 Soviet Jews immigrated to Israel. That would be the equivalent of 60 million new Americans immigrating to the United States in 1 decade. These Soviet Jews were 2% of the Russian population, but they were 20% of the Russian engineers and 30% of the Russian doctors, and they came to Israel. Now, imagine that kind of an educated workforce and the mentality of a risk-taking immigrant fueling Israel's technology boom, which at that point just took off. It vaulted Israel into a phenomenal rate of growth. And it capped Israel's emergence from initially, of course, in 1948, a frontier country, to an emerging and developing country for the next 50 years. And of course, today, a fully developed OECD country on a European standard. Very much like Israel, I viewed New York as on a much bigger scale as a huge melting pot. I mean, Haifa was a melting pot, and New York to me was also a melting pot. And certainly, I realized that with education, Baruch College education, and my attitude and my willingness to work hard and be disciplined, that I could exceed, that I could have some high expectation, and indeed, it more than exceeded my expectation. Let me conclude by saying that I got a superb and excellent education, again, free from Baruch College. I got 8 job offers on the day I graduated on the month really that I graduated from at the time the big 8 accounting firms. And of course, I want to say one more time, thank you, Baruch.
I want to thank Jessica Lang for her expert moderation. It's not easy with this group. And most of all, I want to thank the panelists. I think it was an incredibly interesting panel. I know I learned a lot, and I think it represents what we want to do at the Jewish Studies Center, and it represents Baruch College very well. Thank you all for coming. You'll be hearing from us.